Okay, welcome to the third breakout session titled Japan-US Relations, the Role of Japanese Americans. Let me introduce the panelists for this session. Mr. Glen S. Fukushima, Senior Fellow, Center for American Progress. Dr. Michelle T. Maki, Vice Provost, California State University, Dominguez Hills. And this session is moderated by Mr. Taro Kono, member of the House of Representatives. Mr. Kono, please.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to the session. I proposed this session, and I was wondering how many people could actually come to the session when there's a security sessions going on in the next door. So I really appreciate your coming here. Well, today we have two distinguished Japanese American flying across the Pacific, particularly for this session. Glen, I don't know what S stands for, but oh, okay, it's Glen Shigeru Fukushima. Very well known. He has lived in Japan for 22 years or something, and now he's based in Washington, D.C., and he comes to Japan 10, 12 times a year. And and to my left, it's Michelle Maki. He's a provost of California State University, Dominguez Hill. He's a USC graduate all the way from undergrad to doctor, I guess. And in California, he's often talked about possible successor to late Senator Daniel Inoue. Still, a lot of people say Mitch Maki will run for federal office one day. I've heard that 10 years ago, and I still continue to hear that, and I'm just hoping he would eventually end up in Washington, D.C. as well. This is a particular session on Japanese American community in United States and their relationship with us. Well, the history of Japanese American is not well known, so I asked Mitch Maki, who has written a book on redress, and a very famous one, to prepare a short presentation on Japanese American history. So let us start out with Mitch's presentation, and we'll follow from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kono-san. Before we begin, thank you very much for joining us here today. And I thought that I would start off by telling you a very short story that kind of encapsulates the Japanese American experience. When I came here, I couldn't help but think of my grandmother. And if there's any word that would describe the life of my grandmother, that word would be hard. She came to America as a young girl, worked on the plantations in Hawaii, got married at a young age, and by the time she was 30, she had 6 children. And she never lived much above the poverty line. And so whatever hopes and dreams she had for her family in America rested on the shoulders of her children and of her grandchildren. Now, like most sansei, I'm sansei, I don't speak much Japanese. And my grandmother in Issei didn't speak much English. In fact, my favorite memory of her is her chasing me around saying, "Urusai, urusai." You know, I used to hear that so often as a child, I thought it was a term of endearment. I thought she was saying, "My dear grandson, my dear grandson." But just because she couldn't speak English and I couldn't speak Japanese didn't mean that we couldn't communicate. My mother was there and she would translate. And the message was always the same. Be good, take care of family, remember who you are. Remember who you are. And I think that captures the experience of many Japanese Americans. The irony is, as we have become more assimilated and acculturated to America, it is harder to remember who we are in terms of our ethnic heritage. And with each passing generation, we become more American. So with that, let me give you a very brief history of Japanese Americans. So in 1853, Commodore Perry arrives in Japan, and that opens the door for relations between the United States and Japan, and then eventually immigrants to come to the United States. By 1890, about 40 years after this, there are 12,000 Japanese in Hawaii and 2,000 Japanese on the mainland. But they came to a place that did not welcome them. There were alien land laws which prohibited Japanese from owning land. There were anti-miscegenation laws which prevented Japanese from marrying outside of their race. They couldn't live in certain areas. They couldn't own power machinery. So there were many laws against Japanese at that time, and they were considered aliens ineligible to citizenship. They were not seen simply as a foreign people. They were seen as an inferior people at that time. We then have, in the early 1900s, the picture brides, or the arranged marriages, where young women would be sent to the United States for arranged marriage with these Issei sojourners that were here in the United States. The most important part of this is that from those marriages came children, and the children were the Nisei, the first generation of American-born Japanese, US citizens by birth. We then have the Immigration Act of 1924. Now, in 1920, there were about now 111,000 Japanese in America, but the Immigration Act of 1924 essentially closed the door to immigration of Japanese to the United States. By 1930, we have about 138,000 Japanese in America. These are Japanese Americans that increased because of the birth. We then know what happens on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Japanese in America, 2/3 of whom were American citizens by birth, wondered what would happen to them. Would they be treated like the enemy, treated like Japanese from Japan, or would they be protected by the Constitution because they were, in fact, American citizens? Well, we received our answer about 2 months later when, on February 19th, 1942, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And this created the underpinnings by which 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry would be removed from the west coast of the United States and sent to concentration camps. The very young and the very old. People lost their homes, people lost their jobs, people lost their neighborhoods, people lost almost all of their belongings. But most important, what people lost, what Japanese Americans lost, was their sense of place at the American table of citizenship. We were sent off to one of 10 concentration camps. This is Manzanar, California. And these were concentration camps where people were made to live in barracks, surrounded by barbed wire, machine gun towers. They were in the middle of the deserts or in the middle of swampland. And again, people would live there for 3 to 4 years during the duration of the war. During this time, though, something spectacular happens, and that's that the US Army realized that the war effort was going very poorly in 1943 and that they needed more men to go off and fight in Europe. They created an all-Japanese American unit, and this is a photograph of one of the units after a battle. These were young men, really they were boys, ages 18, 19, 20 years old, that were asked to go and fight for life, liberty, and equality across the globe while their own families were behind barbed wire in the United States. They became the most decorated unit of their size in American military history. And part of the reason why that they became the most decorated unit is that many of them earned Purple Hearts, the medal that you receive when you're either wounded or killed. After the war, Japanese Americans are given $25 and a one-way train ticket. They're sent home, and many of them, this is what they came to. They found their old homes where people had ransacked it, or in this case, written "No Japs Wanted." So it was a difficult transition, as you can imagine, in the late 1940s, as Japanese Americans attempted to rebuild their lives and to try to become American. And what's interesting about that time is that they decided to be 110% American. There was a sense of shame, a sense that somehow we had done something wrong in America, that the United States government would treat us like this. So the reaction was to be 110% American so that this would never happen again. And that's why a lot of sansei my age, we don't speak Japanese. We don't know the culture. You know, we still eat the food and we still know the bad words, but we're not really conversant in Japanese because we were told to be 110% American. But then something starts to happen in the 1959. This is a picture. Does anyone know who this is? This is Senator Inoue when he fought for the 442nd. As you can see in this picture, he has both of his arms. This is a picture taken before that battle in which he lost his right arm fighting for his country, the United States of America. So in 1959, he's elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from the state of Hawaii. But the Japanese community is still a long ways away from understanding what happened during World War II and wanting to talk about it. And let me give you a very quick example. In 1962, at UCLA, there was a professor named Roger Daniels, and he had an assignment, an autobiography. He had two young sansei students, and they both started off their autobiography by saying, I was born in Los Angeles in 1943, blah, 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 blah. He calls them both into his office, and he said, there's something wrong with your autobiography. And they looked at each other, and they said, we didn't cheat. And how do you cheat on an autobiography? You know, it's impossible, right? So he says, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Go home, talk to your families. The next day, one of the students did come back, and he said, you're right, Dr. Daniels. I talked to my family. I was born in 1943, but not in Los Angeles. There were no Japanese Americans in Los Angeles in 1943. They had all been sent off to camp. He said, I was born in Manzanar, California, a concentration camp. The pain, the shame, the wanting to forget was so powerful for Japanese Americans that at times, and in this case, they did not tell their own children about where they were born. But in 1959, we have someone now in Washington, D.C. We then have Spark Matsunaga, who's elected in 1976 as senator from the state of Hawaii. In 1974, we have Norm Mineta, who was elected to the House of Representatives from San Jose, California. Norm was a 10-year-old boy when his family was sent off to Heart Mountain concentration camp. And in 1978, we have Bob Matsui, who was a 6-month-old baby when he and his family were sent off to a concentration camp during World War II. So in the 1970s, we have now 2 decorated war veterans and 2 former inmates of an American concentration camp. They lead the battle, and that's a whole nother discussion that could take hours to tell that story. But they lead the battle, and the community followed, saying justice delayed is justice denied. So this is a community that 30 years earlier had said, shigata ganai, we can't help what's happening, we go to camp. But in the late 70s and early 80s, the chant was justice delayed is justice denied. On August 10th, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signs the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which grants an apology and $20,000 redress payments to every individual who was affected by Executive Order 9066. And it also created, at that time, a $50 million trust fund for the community. So that's the story of the Japanese American community up until 1988. But we also now have gone on to have other famous Japanese Americans. So, who's that? Oh, I guess she's not that famous, huh? Christy Yamaguchi, who was the 1992 Olympic gold medalist, Japanese American. Who's that? That's Senator Inoue, who passed away 2 years ago. Anybody know who this is? Go ahead, who is that? Star Trek, right. George Takei, actor. He's famous for Star Trek, right. Anybody know who this is? Not very familiar face. Paul Terasaki, a medical researcher. It's his work that allows us to do organ transplants, the tissue typing work. He did groundbreaking work. And finally, anybody know who this is? Ellison Onizuka, who was an astronaut who died in the Challenger accident in the 80s. Again, these are some of the famous Japanese Americans who have gone on to not be viewed as Japanese Americans, but just great Americans. So very quickly, some US Census data. The population of the United States is 308 million. The Asian population in the United States is 17 million, so about 5.6%. Anybody want to guess Japanese American? 1.3 million. Less than half of a percent of the United States is ethnically Japanese. Now, of that 1.3 million, 763,000 are full Japanese. Mother and father are Japanese. 78,000 are mixed Japanese and other Asian, and 462,000 are mixed with other non-Asian. The significance of this, and the reason why I tell you this, is that 41% of Japanese Americans are of mixed heritage. So that 1.3 million, about half of them are not pure Japanese, but are mixed with other ethnicities. And that's where the United States is going. Finally, Japanese Americans are the 6th largest Asian group in the United States. Any guess as to the number 1 group? Largest Asian group in the United States? Asian. Chinese. Next. Let's see. Filipino. Okay, now you want to go with Korean? Nope. Asian Indian, followed by Vietnamese. There's the Korean. And finally, Japanese are the 6th largest group. We used to be the 1st or 2nd largest group back in the 60s and 70s. So as you can see, we are a small group even within the Asian community, and even amongst our own membership. We are not all, quote unquote, full Japanese, but the mixed Japanese, and therefore adding in other ethnicities, is the trend that we're seeing in the United States. So with that, that's an overview of who Japanese Americans are.
Well, thank you very much. Glenn, would you like to add?
Sure. So I think Mitch has given you an excellent overview of the history of Japanese Americans. I'd like to make a few comments more specifically related to the issue of Japanese Americans and U.S.-Japan relations. The first thing I want to say is that Japanese Americans are a very diverse group. So I can give you some examples later, but for instance, one example, I'll start with one example. On issues like, for instance, comfort women, which has been coming up throughout this symposium or this conference today, even within the Japanese American population, you find on the one hand Senator Inoue, who tends to be more, was more on the Japanese government's side of the issue. On the other hand, we've had Representative Mike Honda, who is a representative from the state of California, from San Jose, who is actually quite critical of the Japanese government on the issue of comfort women. So just on that even one example, I think you'll find that the Japanese American community is quite a diverse community. Also between Mitch and myself, we also are quite different in our backgrounds, because Mitch is basically from Hawaii, but mainly from living in California. I'm an Army brat, and so my father is Nisei. He was in an internment camp in Amachi in Colorado during the war, and he was in the U.S. military for about 25 years. So I moved around quite a bit, basically within California and Japan, but I've also lived on the East Coast for a number of years. So I have been quite involved in U.S.-Japan relations, unlike most of my Japanese American friends. When I was growing up on U.S. military bases in California and in Japan, I met quite a few other Japanese Americans who were in a similar situation to me, that is, their fathers were U.S. military and their mothers were from Japan. And these kids often could speak Japanese, rather elementary kind of family Japanese, not formal Japanese, but they couldn't read or write. So when I was growing up, I actually thought that most Japanese Americans could speak Japanese. But then when I went to Gardena High School in Los Angeles, almost all of my Japanese American friends had never been in Japan, could not speak any Japanese. And then when I went to Stanford as an undergraduate, there are quite a few Japanese Americans from Hawaii, especially from the Iolani School and Punahou School, 2 private schools in Hawaii. And these Japanese Americans in Hawaii were completely different from the Japanese Americans I knew in Los Angeles. And then when I went to Harvard, I ran into a number of Japanese Americans, like people like Francis Fukuyama, who grew up in a totally non-Japanese American environment. So even in my own experience, there are at least 4 distinct groups of Japanese Americans I've experienced. Those who are from military background, those who are in Los Angeles, those from Hawaii, and those from the East Coast. So one thing I really want to emphasize is how diverse Japanese Americans are. In my experience in the 1970s and 80s, I worked rather closely with the JACL, Japanese American Citizens League, on issues related to U.S.-Japan relations as kind of an advisor. And then in the 1990s until now, I worked with the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles on U.S.-Japan issues. And more recently, since about 4 years ago, there's a new organization created called the U.S.-Japan Council, which actually I gave the name U.S.-Japan Council to this organization. But each of these, in its own way, JACL, Japanese American National Museum, and the U.S.-Japan Council, have dealt with issues related to U.S.-Japan relations. So I have been involved, and I must say I've been a bit frustrated by what I have felt to be inadequate interest on the part of Japanese Americans in U.S.-Japan relations. But this lack of interest, which I think Mitch alluded to in his talk, is understandable given the fact that Japanese Americans, especially with the wartime experience, many of the first and second generation Japanese Americans had educated their children, third generation Japanese Americans, that being involved with Japan really doesn't add anything, probably is a negative. And therefore, I think many Japanese Americans who were in my cohort, people who went to high school in the 1960s and 70s, for instance, or college in the 60s and 70s, I think many Japanese Americans felt there was no real incentive to interacting with Japan. In fact, there was a disincentive to doing that. At the same time, however, I felt that on the Japanese side as well, in the post-war period, the Japanese government has not been very favorable to Japanese Americans. In fact, I remember attending a conference a few years ago in Los Angeles where Mr. Kono's father, Yohei Kono, gave a speech in which I quoted from in one of the speeches I've given, in which Mr. Kono said, "As a former foreign minister of Japan, I probably should not say this, but I will have to say that the Japanese government's attitude toward Japanese Americans in the post-war period has been very cold." And I think it's true. This is in major contrast to countries like China or South Korea or India or probably any other country that you can think of which has people from their countries who immigrated to the United States. In fact, I remember the Prime Minister of India a few years ago when he visited the United States at a speech he gave at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He explicitly talked about the important role that Indian Americans have been playing to promote relations between India and the United States. I think it's only recently, thanks to the efforts of people like Mr. Kono and his father, that some Japanese leaders have started to pay attention to the contributions that Japanese Americans have made to U.S.-Japan relations. Also, there have been some studies by Japanese academics, like Professor Takezawa at Kyoto University, who found that Japanese companies that had invested in the United States had not treated Japanese Americans very well. And she points to this as one of the reasons that she feels that there's a distance between the Japanese American community in the United States and Japanese companies. Now, there are some exceptions. I think Sony being a major exception, Mr. Morita in particular, in part because he had a certain Japanese American attorney who was very helpful to Sony, and also because he hired a person named Nishiyama Sen, who originally was Nisei from Utah, who ended up being a major advisor to Sony and to Mr. Morita. And so Mr. Morita of Sony had an appreciation for the contributions Japanese Americans could make in U.S.-Japan relations. Another reason that I think that many people in Japan, at least the establishment in Japan, have not taken much interest in Japanese Americans is that, and Senator Inoue used to talk about this a lot, many Japanese leaders, especially of the older generation, looked down on Japanese Americans as basically people whose ancestors left Japan because they couldn't make it in Japan. But But that's true with, probably any other country in the world. The people left their countries to go to the United States because they felt there were more opportunities in the United States. That's true. But for some reason, the Japanese establishment seems to have, until recently, felt that that because these people left Japan, that somehow they're not as good as people who stayed in Japan. And I think this is changing now, in part because of the perception, correctly, that Japanese Americans are playing an important role in the United States. And so with people like Senator Inoue or Norman Mineta or Bob Matsui or Spark Matsunaga and others, I think there's a recognition by people in Japan that actually Japanese Americans are recognized in the United States as solid American citizens, and therefore people in Japan are starting to pay greater attention. It's also the case, however, that I've felt that many people in Japan, to the extent that they have an interest in Japanese Americans, have had some unrealistic expectations, thinking, why can't Japanese Americans play a role in U.S.-Japan relations the way that Jewish Americans play in U.S.-Israeli relations? But for a whole variety of reasons that some of which I've mentioned, I think it's rather unrealistic to expect that. Part of it being the experience of World War II, where Japanese Americans, as Mitch mentioned, were interned. And in partly result of that, the many Japanese Americans, at least in the first and second and third generation, have not had close relations with Japan, in contrast to people from South Korea or China or India or Vietnam or other countries.
Right. Can you make it shorter?
So let me see. So two other points I would make is, number one, there are individual Japanese Americans who have played important roles in U.S.-Japan relations, but compared to these other countries from Asia, I think that it would not be realistic to expect that Japanese Americans as a whole would play that kind of role. And the final thing I would say is that, just as Mitch Maki mentioned with the statistics, that there is a very increasing rapid growth of Asian Americans in the United States. And Asian Americans, especially Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Indian Americans, and others, who are increasingly playing important roles in U.S. society in terms of politics, business, academia, journalism, and so forth. And I think that people in Japan, especially Japanese leaders, including diplomats, have not, until recently, paid enough attention to that, because that has certain implications for the influence that they have on U.S. foreign policy, especially U.S. foreign policies towards Asia. And that is a whole area that I think I have been trying to tell my Japanese government friends that they should pay more attention to this for the last 15 years, but only recently have they come to pay some attention. So that would be the last thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, as Glenn said, the Japanese government didn't really pay much attention to the Japanese American community. But late Senator Inoue, who used to, I met him, 17 years ago for the first time. And back then, he told me later he wasn't feeling comfortable dealing with Japan because he's Japanese American. He doesn't want to be seen he's favorable to Japan because he's Japanese American. But later on, he was so established in the Senate, and he said he was very confident if he deal with Japan, no one would criticize him. And so he took initiative to make a bridge between Japanese American community in United States and Japan. And at the same time, the foreign ministry in Japan decided this is an important issue. So the foreign ministry started out a program called the Japanese American Leadership Delegation. Every year, I think we now invite 10 Japanese American leaders in each community. It used to be California and Hawaii, but now it's Seattle, Texas, New York, Washington, and they are invited to Japan for several weeks, and they go around Japan. And Mitch was second-year delegation or first-year delegation. Would you like to talk about that program?
Before I do that, let me just say one last thing about Senator Inoue. For those of you who may not realize this, when he passed away 2 years ago, he was the Senate pro tem. And what that means, he was fourth in line to the presidency. There's the President of the United States. If he dies, the Vice President takes over. If he dies, Speaker of the House. And if he dies, Speaker pro tem. So Senator Inoue, a Japanese American, was number 4 in the United States. It's quite a significant position when you think about it. And when you think about several decades earlier, our whole community was sent to concentration camps. And it was because of that status that he could openly talk about his views of Japan and be able to say that it's important that the United States government understand who Japanese Americans are and how important our relationship is with Japan. As Kono-san mentioned, in 2002 I came to Japan with a delegation of other Japanese American leaders, and every year since then 10 to 12 Japanese Americans come every year and meet with members of the foreign ministry, with the Diet, and so forth, and get to know Japan. And it's incredibly important that we continue this. I would even argue that we should do this at a younger age for teenagers or college students, because they truly will be the next leaders in the generation to come. We have a lot of work to do for the reasons that Glen talked about in fostering the relationships between Japanese Americans and Japanese. You know, many of us, like myself, don't speak the language. You know, we've been taught at an early age there's nothing to be gained by working closely with Japan, when in fact just the opposite is true. You know, this is the most important political relationship in the world, Japan and the United States. And to what extent Japanese Americans can play a role, I think we need to take full advantage of that. You know. But I would agree that it can't be the central or only role, you know, in the sense that Japanese Americans are not the only part of the United States.
Foreign Minister Kishida went to Los Angeles last year, and it so happened he was first foreign minister who came to LA since my father as a foreign minister visited LA. So it's been more than 10 years. And I don't think Prime Minister of this country has been to LA for, I don't know, two decades, 3 decades. So I think we really need Prime Minister not just go to New York or Washington, but he needs to stop over in LA, San Francisco or Hawaii to make a new bridge between the Japanese American community. Yes, Glenn?
Last fall, the then chairman of a major Japanese media organization, whose name I will not mention, but it's the largest media organization in Japan, the chairman visited Washington, D.C., and I was at a lunch. I was invited to a lunch. I asked him, I said, how many people from Japan do you have stationed in the United States? He said, 19. I said, of the 19, how many are stationed outside of New York and Washington, D.C.? He said, 1. So he said, there's 1 in Los Angeles. 18 of the 19 are in Washington, D.C. and New York, because I think from a Japanese establishment perspective, when they look at the United States, many of them have a very old view of the United States. They think that basically all of business is decided in New York, all of politics is decided in Washington, and that's it. Whereas the United States over the last 50 years especially has become so diverse in terms of political power, economic power, gender, race. It's become extremely diverse. And I think for Japan to better understand and deal with the United States, Japan has to understand the diversity, but it's very difficult to do that if you have 18 out of 19 people in New York and Washington.
Kono-san, I would agree with you that it's incredibly important that the Prime Minister come and visit. So I'll make a deal with you. I'll run for federal office, you become Prime Minister, and then you come visit us.
All right. That's a deal. Well, we've been talking about the comfort woman and the history issues since this morning, and we just talked about in the last session in the Japanese politics. But there are comfort woman statue being built in California and other cities in United States. What do Japanese American community think of that? And how are they reacting? And what do you recommend the Japanese government or Japanese people to react to that movement?
I'll take first shot and then you finish up on that. I think it's important to remember just how diverse the Japanese American community is. And there are It ranges from those who are activists, who are very much involved with the issues of the comfort women or the Yasukuni shrine visit every year, all the way to those who know nothing about it and who don't care about it. And we run the gamut in the Japanese American community. So that there's a tremendous diversity there. I think the story of Japanese American redress and the apology that the United States gave to its own citizens, Japanese Americans, is a very powerful one. But I always caution my students that that's an American story. That's a story that took place in America that has a different political context, a different cultural context, and a different set of values that drive us. But it is an example of how a people, Japanese Americans in this case, can find their voice to be able to express what happened to them. And I think that that's part of the equation that maybe needs to be explored.
So I agree with Mitch, and I would just add a few other points. One is, I think, in addition to the diversity that's obviously among Japanese Americans, I think it'd be accurate to say that the immigration from South Korea to the United States has been much more recent than the immigration from Japan to the United States. So as Mitch mentioned, the Japanese immigration started in the 1800s, and there hasn't been a lot of new immigrants from Japan. So that means that the distance between the Japanese American community and the United States, I mean, in Hawaii, there are 5th, 6th generation Japanese Americans. On the mainland, maybe 4th, 5th generation. So that the distance between those communities and the country of the ancestors is much greater in the case of Japan than in the case of Koreans. In the case of Koreans, in part because of this more recent immigration, and also because Korea recognizes dual citizenship, there are people who actually were, say, born in Korea but raised in the United States, speak fluent English, totally bilingual, and may have dual citizenship, South Korean and Japanese citizens. So these people are much more attuned to, much closer to the activities in South Korea. I think that's another reason that Japanese Americans are less engaged on this issue. And as Mitch said, to the extent that Koreans and Korean Americans in the United States, as well as the South Koreans, characterize the comfort movement issue as an issue of civil rights, of human rights, of women's rights, I think there are many people in the Japanese American community who believe that the victims need to be compensated, they need to be recognized for the wrongs that have been done. So frankly, I'm not aware that there are that many Japanese Americans who are actively engaged on this issue of comfort women. I did see some articles in the Los Angeles Times about the comfort women statue in Glendale, but the names of the people I read in the newspaper who are listed in the so-called Japanese American community opposing are actually Japanese nationals. There's one particular person I know who used to be a professor at USC who's actually from Japan. He may have become a Japanese citizen, a US citizen by now. But so again, I don't think there are that many Japanese Americans I know who are engaged on this issue. And frankly, I have a lot of contact with the Korean American community, both in Washington, D.C. and in the San Francisco Bay Area. You know, when I talk with them, they never mention the comfort women issue. And I don't frankly think it's such a huge issue in the Korean American community. I think often the Japanese media really focus a great deal, like front page news, on these issues, when actually in the United States it's not such a huge issue.
One more example is the difference that Glenn talked about in terms of how Senator Inoue approached this issue versus how Representative Mike Honda approaches this issue. Representative Mike Honda is a real advocate for some type of apology, some type of restitution or atonement. Because he comes from that background of being an activist, of being a labor union individual, and I think he truly believes that a wrong was done and needs to be addressed. Senator Inoue, and I had more discussions with Senator Inoue when he was alive about this. It wasn't that he didn't believe that something bad had happened or that it was, you know, an atrocity or anything along that lines, but he also felt that the relations between U.S. and Japan needed to be maintained and that there were other issues that needed to be addressed. So again, not that either one is right or wrong, but that it runs the gamut between what people believe needs to be done versus what other priorities they believe also exist in U.S.-Japan relations.
Thank you. So I mean, the Japanese American community is now the 6th largest community among the Asian Americans. What are the relationship between the Japanese Americans and other Asian American communities? And as Asian American, what are the major issues right now in the United States? And I see some Chinese American, Koreans American running for the office. So what do you foresee is coming among the Asian Americans?
I think the Japanese American community is not only growing smaller numerically, but we're growing smaller in terms of economic power, political power, or influence in the United States. And it's for all the reasons that Glen has been talking about in terms of the lack of immigration. You know, we don't have a large Japanese immigration. We don't have things that connect us to Japan, and we don't also have the resources that may be coming into our community. And as the numbers indicate, our community, some would say it's being diluted, some would say it's growing. It's a matter of perspective. But the reality is that our community is becoming more and more diverse and more mixed ethnically, and geographically we're moving out into different areas. For example, I live in a place called Monterey Park, California, and I grew up in Monterey Park, and when I grew up, about 10% of my high school class was Japanese American, a pretty good number. My kids go to the same high school that I went to, and in their 8th grade class, there were only 5 Japanese Americans, and 2 of them were my kids because they're twins. Right? One was Japanese, born to Japanese parents who just immigrated, so she was Shin Nisei. Another one was Hapa, half Japanese, half white. And the last one was actually Korean, who was adopted by Japanese parents. So you can see that the number of Japanese Americans in the neighborhood that I grew up in is dwindling. And so our political power, our economic power is dispersing. And we don't have the same political clout as we once had. We don't have anyone in office now that's of the stature of Daniel Inouye. We have one U.S. Senator from Hawaii, but she's 67 years old. She's not going to be there much longer, maybe 10 years hopefully, but not anywhere near the 50 years that Daniel Inouye was there. And in California, we have 4 representatives from the state of California, all from non-Japanese American districts. So they were able to get elected in that way. I think we're falling behind the other Asian American groups in terms of the organizational power and the influence and just the visibility on TV and in the media.
I think the demographics are what Mitch mentioned. So I guess what that actually means is that Japanese Americans will have to play a role in the greater Asian American community or in the general American community overall. So for instance, just to talk about me personally, in the last few weeks, I've gotten together with some friends of mine, and we've created a PAC, a political action committee. I've contributed some funds, some others are contributing. We're going to create a $1 million fund, and we're going to be supporting Asian Americans who are running for politics. And our criterion is basically progressive Asian Americans running for politics. And so this will include Japanese Americans, but also Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, others. But I think that the demographics are such, as Mitch mentioned, that probably over time it's going to make less and less sense for Japanese Americans to identify with the Japanese American community per se, because the community is becoming so diverse. So I personally expect that Japanese Americans will continue to play, and will probably be more people in Japanese Americans as individuals playing leadership roles, whether it's in the Asian American community or in the larger community in the United States, but less identified as Japanese American community per se.
The flip side to the diversity issue is that as Japanese Americans become more diverse, as they become more mixed, there's value and lessons in that, because that's what's going to happen in the United States. As you see, the leadership of the United States is becoming more diverse. Right now we have an African American as president, but the reality is in the next 20, 30 years, you're going to see many more Asian Americans, African Americans, and Latino Americans in leadership positions. And I think that the Japanese American experience can be of assistance to Japan in knowing how to deal with the diversity in the United States, as well as the growing diversity that will start to occur here in Japan as there's more immigration.
So what would you two recommend the Japanese government to do, say, next 10 years, 20 years between Japan and the Japanese American community? Or what would you recommend Japanese American community to do to recreate a bridge with Japan?
Well, I think things like the Japanese American Leadership Delegation that was created in 2000, I guess, yeah, in 2000. I think that is positive, but it's a very small scale program of 10 to 12 Japanese Americans per year. I think expanding that kind of a program and also perhaps starting on a high school level and also having college level and a professional level. I think, those, in a sense, because of the fact that I actually think that, since the end of World War II until about let's say until 2000, when the Japanese government started this JALD, Japanese American Leadership Delegation Program, for about a 50-year period, there was really a very thin tie between the Japanese American community and Japan. Very unlike the ties between other ethnic groups in the United States and the countries of their ancestors. So I think it actually requires some kind of an effort, maybe an artificial effort, to try to strengthen this. And so I do think that programs like the JALD on multiple levels could be helpful. In fact, you probably know that Israel, Taiwan, China, Korea, they all have programs similar with a lot more people and much bigger budgets. So that would be, I guess, my recommendation. And again, I think that it's certainly realistic for individual Japanese Americans to play roles trying to connect the United States and Japan. I don't, frankly, and I speak from my 30-some years of experience working with the JACL, working with the Japanese American National Museum, working with the U.S.-Japan Council. I think the Japanese American community itself is so diverse that I think it's not realistic to expect Japanese Americans as a group, but you can expect individual Japanese Americans to play roles.
I would agree with that. And it's important to remember, Glenn said he's been working with the JCL for 40 years. 40 years ago, the Japanese American community was in a place where they wanted nothing to do with Japan. They were fighting for the redress movement and the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. They were saying at that time, we have nothing to do with Japan. We're Americans. That was our pro-American era. I would say in the 90s and in the 2000s, the Japanese American community is starting to begin to realize we do have roots here. And while Glenn is right, not all Japanese Americans feel that, we can find those key individuals. The other point that I want to support is that we should start earlier. High school, maybe even middle school. And I'll give you an example. My son plays baseball, and Hideo Nomo just brought a team to Los Angeles, and my son got a chance to play against the Japanese team. Now, my last name is Maki, so Troy is pitching, and the third batter that comes up was some kid from Japan whose last name is Maki. So it's Maki versus Maki. And everybody in the crowd got very excited, and one guy yells, "Maki's gonna win this one." We didn't know which one, right? Now, this Maki won because my son got him to ground out, and that was a great experience. Afterwards, though, we went up to the other player, took a picture with him, and I could see in my son's eyes, because my son had no interest in Japan prior to this, right? But he said, hey, that kid had the same last name. And he began to wonder what his experience was in Japan. And it was through baseball that became an interest to him. And so he's very interested in Japan now. He's very interested in what I'm doing here today and wanting to hear more about it. So I think we need to have more of these exchange programs, primarily for Japanese American kids. centered around sports or cultural activities, whatever captures them in their moment as a 14, 15, 16-year-old. And I've seen it in other sports, I've seen it in other activities such as anime clubs and so forth, where there's that connection and the kids connect on that level, but then they also realize there are deeper roots that bind them together.
Thank you. So I would like to open the floor for the questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and identify yourself, please.
My name is Carl Kay. I'm an American living here in Tokyo. And I've been on like I used to be a board member of the Japan Society of Boston, for example, and there's a whole infrastructure in the United States of organizations relating to Japan, as many of you know. And when I think of it, I always thought the Japan Society of Boston in particular, you know, the roots are kind of the old merchant families from Salem and Boston that did trade with Japan, you know, back in the 19th century. And, you know, it's obviously evolved from there, but there's still, you know, if you look at the board members, I was an exception, but, you know, there's some of that kind of element to that. And I've always wondered, like, what is the relationship of the Japanese American community to that sort of infrastructure? Is that, you know, and how do Japanese American community view people like me? You know, I'm American 100%. I married someone Japanese, and my kids are, you know, half American, half Japanese, and they're, you know, until somebody catches them with their passports, they're dual citizens. But you know, we're working on that with Kono Sensei, you know, to eventually make that allowed and all that. So, you know, it just seems like it's so complicated, this ethnicity and then the various organizations. But how do Japanese Americans view, you know, white people interested in Japan? You know, is that a friendly relationship? Is that an awkward relationship?
I think the answer could span the gamut, and you know, we could give you examples of a number of different instances. But I would say that in the 1960s, your children would not be completely accepted as Japanese Americans. Because when I was growing up, you know, if you were full Japanese American, you were in. If you were anything less, then, well, we got to check you out, kind of thing. That has changed over the years now, partly out of a necessity to keep our community alive, so that anybody who has Japanese blood in them who is in America is considered to be Japanese American. I've even had discussions with individuals as, would we consider you Japanese American, in the sense that, you know, you live in a household where there are 3 people who have ethnic Japanese blood, and culturally you are probably exposed to more Japanese things than my children are. Not, okay, I don't like natto, but so, you know, the question is, are you Japanese American, and what is it really to be Japanese American? And that then becomes an academic discussion. But I would say things have changed in that sense. I think the reality is that all efforts to build bridges with Japan are efforts that we need to take a hard look at, and if they're good efforts, we need to support them. You know, whether they are for ethnically Japanese American youngsters or individuals, or whether they're for any ethnicity within the United States.
So I agree with Mitch, but I think that there's a real generational change, you know, over the last, I'd say, 30 or 40 years. And so I think Japanese American community has become much more open. It used to be, I think, when I was going to high school in Los Angeles, pretty insular, pretty inward-looking, and pretty exclusive. But I think there's been a generational change and a much more openness. The one other thing I wanted to say was, oh yeah, here's one thing I found very interesting. As a Japanese American who's been involved in, quote-unquote, Japanese studies, the study of Japan in the United States, right? There are some Japanese Americans, obviously, who are involved in the study of Japan in the Japanese studies community. But the community of those who are involved in so-called Asian American studies and those involved in Japanese studies are like totally, it's like there's a null set in between. It's like until just maybe just recently there have been a few studies that try to connect the Asian American studies community to the Japanese studies community. But the two until recently were just totally separate. And By the same token, when, for instance, Japanese Americans go on this Japanese American leadership delegation to Japan, and then they ask me for advice on how they can stay involved with Japan after they come back to the United States, one of the first things I ask them is, well, are you a member of the Japan Society or the Japan-America Society in your city? And about 80% of the time the answer is no, because there's been no connection between the Japanese Americans and those organizations in the United States, which are primarily white, that involve Japan. But I think that that's starting to change. And organizations like the U.S.-Japan Council, I think, is starting to kind of make it easier to cross those boundaries.
Thank you. Any other questions? Don't be shy. Yes, the back.
Yeah, actually, I wasn't sure what might be the relevance of this topic to me, being a sort of a white Brit. But it's actually been fascinating listening to you, and both Mitch and Glenn. I mean, the depth of your engagement in the two communities, and also you're so explicit in talking about, very explicit in talking about, you have one leg in one culture, the other leg in another culture, and this is all very sort of transparent. I mean, coming from the UK, there's the immigrant experience appears to be completely different. We have a large South Asian contingent. It's still quite raw. A lot of them came over in the 1960s, not in the 1800s. A lot of deprivation in those communities, both Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian. And you really don't get this sense of being able to articulate so fluently the fact that you belong to two communities. I think young people do not sort of, but often they can't speak the language of their home country. That's partly because their upbringing may have been very traditional in some sense, or they go to purely secular British institutions, which perhaps create precisely that pressure and stress, which then leads to a lot of Brits joining the jihad movement. As you know, we're famous for having more jihadis possibly in the UK than there are in Syria. So I guess this is more of a comment than a question. But thanks, both of you, for enlightening me on a number of issues.
Well, thank you for that comment. And as I'm listening to you, I think everything we're talking about really is generational. Because I'm thinking if my children were here, and I have twins that are 15 years old, they don't identify as strongly as being Asian American. Well, they use the term Asian American, Japanese American, but I'm not sure it means the same thing to them that it does to me, because of our generational differences and experiences that I grew up with. I think in my age range, I've experienced much more racism based on being Japanese American. I've been called Jap. I've been given strange looks, and we've all almost gotten into fights over things like that. That's not been the experience for my children. And so while they use the terms Asian American and Japanese American, I think it'll be interesting to see where they're at in 30 years.
Just one comment is I find myself actually operating in 3 different communities. When I come to Japan, I'm basically dealing with the Japanese community, speaking Japanese and trying to follow the norms here pretty much. When I'm in the United States, it's pretty much the Washington, D.C. mode of operations, although I do spend some time in San Francisco. And then there's a Japanese American community, which has a whole different protocol, I think. So I do find that there are at least these 3 distinct communities that I have to deal with in different ways.
Any other questions? Okay.
So the title is The Role of Japanese Americans, and I've listened to all of your comments about that, and I was just wondering, I think the basic point is that U.S. has become so diverse now, and how do you think some non-Asian Americans are attached to their old country? For instance, Polish Americans, are they attached to Poland as much as the Japanese Americans, or I know the Jewish Americans are attached to Israel, but aside from that, what are your
my
views?
sense is that it's very generational. It depends on obviously if you're first, second, or maybe third generation, you have closer ties with the country of your ancestors. I mean, I run into people in the U.S. who are from Russia, for instance, and they have very close ties to Russia, right? And so I think a lot of it is generational, but I do think one of the things as Asian Americans I still believe is that how you look actually does make a difference, even in a very diverse country like the United States. So, for instance, I think it's really interesting that Henry Kissinger, with a very strong German accent, was the National Security Advisor for Richard Nixon, Secretary of State for Nixon. Zbigniew Brzezinski, was with a strong accent, was the National Security Advisor for Jimmy Carter. Madeleine Albright, a naturalized U.S. citizen, Secretary of State. But all these people, people in the United States don't raise any question about them because they look like they're Caucasian Americans. They look like Caucasian Americans, right? So, I mean, I really think that it's important for Asian Americans, including Japanese Americans, to get engaged in business and government and politics and so forth, in part because I think when we have an Asian American as a Secretary of State or Asian American as national security advisors, I think it will show just how much Asian Americans are a part of the central fabric of American society. And I actually think that before too long we will have those Asian Americans. So I do think that I think it's Asian Americans have made a lot of strides in the United States, but I think there's still some ways to go. But I think that for Japanese Americans, it's not so much focusing on being Japanese American, but if it's necessary to focus on being non-white, then I think it's better to focus on being Asian American. And more, I think it's I think myself that the race factor has become less and less relevant.
I would agree with that, and I think what Glenn said is very important, that it is generational, and it is the degree to which you are visibly different. And I think in your example, the Polish or the Irish or the Italian, the degree to which you live in an ethnic enclave determines how your identity is important to you. And I think one of the outcomes of the incarceration camps during World War II is that it delayed the assimilation of Japanese even more, in probably a generation or two, so that as a sansei and my children as yonsei, we probably hold on to that Japanese American identity longer than a Polish or an Irish or an Italian immigrant might. And plus the fact that visibly they blend in much more easily than we do.
Yes.
Follow-up question from Glenn. There seems to be a vein of ambiguity going through your comments. So basically, is it a good thing? Say you get an Asian American president or a Japanese American president. Does that mean that, okay, you're now sort of quote unquote real Americans, and that therefore there's no point in sort of seeing yourself as a Japanese American?
I guess what I'm trying to say is something a little bit different. I'm saying that there are some Americans who still look at people who look different, that is, people who are not Caucasian Americans, as not being qualified for certain positions. Now, with an African American president, I think we've crossed one hurdle. Probably having a woman president will cross another hurdle, hopefully in a couple of years. But I do think that there is a hurdle that Asian Americans still face in terms of attaining the highest positions in government. For instance, and we've had cabinet officers, but only recently. And so I think in the government, in politics, we've had people like Senator Inoue. So, but there are some barriers that I think we still need to overcome. That's number one. Number two is I do think that, frankly, and speaking very personally, that people in Japan probably would think that Japanese Americans are worth dealing with if there are Japanese Americans in senior positions who are influential. Because one of the things that, when I was an undergraduate at Stanford University, I was involved in a Stanford KO exchange program of students. When I was chairman of the program, I was looking through the files, and I saw that there were some letters from the students from KO University. This is back in the 1960s. Students from KO University said, we don't want Japanese American students coming on this program from Stanford because they're not real Americans, And so there was an active discrimination by these KO students against Japanese Americans. But the Japanese Americans, by and large, had never been to Japan, didn't speak any Japanese. Probably their English was probably better than many of the other Caucasians, who were applying. And I had friends, who were Japanese Americans who had, impeccable credentials. They had masters, even PhDs in English literature, trying to teach Japanese in Japan, but being told that they can't get these jobs because they look Japanese. If you're a Caucasian, if you're uneducated Caucasian, they will still hire you because you look different. You look authentic, right? So, from my personal point of view, I think that actually Senator Inoue has a story. In 1960, I think he came to Japan as part of a USI tour of Asian countries, and he met with the then Prime Minister, Mr. Kishi. And Senator Inoue has a story in which he said this several times. He says he met with Prime Minister Kishi, and he said to Prime Minister Kishi, it's been more than 15 years since the end of World War II. Japanese Americans have made a lot of strides. I think that it might be worthwhile at some point to think about a Japanese American being ambassador to Japan. And Kishi apparently was long silence and said something like, well, how would you feel if we sent a Caucasian to be ambassador to the United States from Japan? And by the way, we Japanese look at these people who left Japan in the 1800s to be losers. They couldn't make it in Japan. That's why they left. And he went further and said, frankly, people in our foreign ministry are people from the nobility. And, Japanese Americans would have a hard time dealing with people in our foreign ministry who were from the noble class. So that kind of, old line thinking that I think in that period among the older generation in Japan is one of the reasons that they haven't, really engaged Japanese Americans as much as I would certainly like them to. Those are some of the factors I think that go into my thinking when I think of the importance of Japanese Americans and Asian Americans playing a more important role in American society. And I would, by just last footnote, say that Korea has had a Korean American as ambassador to Korea. China has had a Chinese American, but I was told in 2008 and by people on the Obama transition team that the Japanese government had explicitly asked the U.S. government not to consider Japanese American to be an ambassador to Japan. So that's what I was told by the Obama
Glenn,
transition.
that example, I was thinking of the exact same thing as you started talking. So I'd like to ask a question of the audience. As Japanese, how would you feel if the next ambassador were Japanese American? How would that play with you, and how would it play in the nation? Would that be accepted or not?
I might not be an average Japanese, but I think that any Japanese American would be accepted. I mean, and I think the media would treat this person very well because the media would be interested in his or her background, and I think that would send a strong message. And I don't think I can't understand why Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if that's true, they had explicitly stated that way.
Well, Glenn, you can be the next ambassador. We have lost Senator Inoue 2 years ago, and his likely successor, the Colleen Hanabusa, lost the primary. So who do you think going to not completely succeed, but follow Senator Inoue's footstep in American politics from Japanese American community?
I'm not sure we know who that person is yet, because as I mentioned earlier, there are 5 Japanese Americans in office. 4 of them are in their mid to late 60s, so they're not going to have the longevity. The reason why Senator Inoue was so powerful was because our Senate is based on seniority. He was in the Senate nearly 50 years, and so he got all the perks for doing that, along with being a great legislator and so forth. But so what that means is we need somebody who is in their 30s or early 40s to be elected now in a state where they're going to be re-elected for the next 40 years. Hawaii is a fertile ground, but even Hawaii is changing in terms of being Japanese American. There isn't a guarantee that you're going to win, as was just played out with Representative Hanabusa. We do have a representative in California, Mark Takano. He is 54 years old. There's a possibility that if he continues to do well, he could have a nice career of 20 or 30 years. But again, he comes from, kind of a rural area in the Los Angeles area or San Bernardino area. So it's hard to say. I think that person hasn't emerged yet as the person that is going to be the next Inoue, if there is going to be another Inoue. I'm not sure we're going to see very many senators of any ethnicity that serve 30 or 40 years anymore.
Yeah, I agree with what Mitch has said. I think Senator Inoue, in addition to the longevity, did have really kind of a unique background in the sense that he did serve in the 442nd. He lost an arm. He's a real American hero. And so he had the kind of credibility and gravitas that I think it's quite unusual. And so that plus being from Hawaii, plus being a very capable person, and the longevity of the 50 years altogether created a person who's very difficult to find a successor for.
Well, we only have 4 minutes left, so I'll give you 2 minutes each for anything to add in the session.
You didn't prepare us for that question. I think, as Glenn said earlier, that I tend to represent the Japanese American community more than he does in terms of my own background. Not speaking Japanese, not coming to Japan nearly as often as Glenn. Glenn knows Japan much better than I do, and yet the time that I've spent here has reinforced in my mind the need for the connection, the need for us to reestablish the ties between Japan and Japanese Americans, because I think there's a missed opportunity if we don't pursue that. So I want to thank you for having this panel and thank the conference for inviting us.
The last point I would make is one that actually Mitch touched upon earlier, and that is, I think there are many lessons that Japan could draw from the Japanese American experience. I'm thinking in particular about dealing with diversity and globalization. There's an organization called LEAP in the United States, Leadership Education for Asian Pacifics, started in 1982 by J.D. Hokoyama. The thinking behind that organization is that Asian Americans may be very highly educated, very capable. However, they're not necessarily represented at senior levels in various organizations. When I was at AT&T, for instance, in Bell Laboratories, which produced 7 Nobel Prize winners, there were lots of Asians from Japan, China, Taiwan, Korea, lots of Asians, and doing very well in higher senior level positions. But in AT&T management, this is back in the 1990s, there were hardly any Asian Americans at the senior levels. And just recently, 4 years ago, Stanford Business School started a program, executive education program, which I've been invited to speak at every year for the last 4 years, which is aimed specifically for Asian American executives. And these are Asian American executives at mid-level who want to aspire to reach senior levels. But the thinking behind this is that there are certain things that are required in order to be successful in corporate America that Asian Americans are not necessarily trained in. I mean, for instance, even things like communication skills, presentation skills, those are not things that many Asian Americans, especially Japanese Americans, are not trained in. And when I was growing up, my parents told me, if there are people in the room who are older or more experienced than you, you shouldn't speak. You should listen to the others and learn from them. Well, when I went to Stanford, I mean, the students who spoke up more and the students who debated more, not only with their students, but with their professors, were the ones who got higher grades. And those are the kind of skills that I think even now Asian Americans are having to have this special program at Stanford Business School in order to learn. I think in many respects, Japanese business leaders also can benefit from those kinds of programs to deal more adequately with diversity, how to manage diverse organizations and diverse groups, communication skills, presentation skills, certainly for Japanese Diet members who go to Washington, D.C. I think, I'm sure that we have some exceptions here, people who don't need that training. But but that's just one example. I think there are a number of other areas in which Japanese-American experience can be of value to Japan if they choose to look at Japanese-Americans that way.
You know, Hori-san just walked into the room, and we just got done thanking the G1 Global for inviting us and having this panel, and how important we think the building the bridges between Japan and Japanese Americans are. So I wanted to say thank you very much to you.
Thank you. Well, this concludes this session. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for your interest. Thank you. And I appreciate for those two panelists.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kono. Again, please give a big applause to our panelists.